Out here, the West ain't just dust and gun smoke, it's blood, betrayal, and legends carved in iron. These are the forgotten tales of outlaws, lawmen, and drifters chasing gold, vengeance, and redemption. Welcome to Dust and Iron Tales. In the lush, isolated valley high in the Sierra Nevada, Oakhaven slept under ancient oaks that whispered of time itself. The town had risen around a silver strike, but its hush-hush owed more to its founder than to any fortune. Mr. Alistair Finch, a meticulous engineer, built the Clockwork claim system, each claim marked by a wooden post with a brass clock face set to the minute the claim would expire. Seraphina Seraph Wells, Oakhaven's lone trained surveyor, moved with a sharp wit and sharp arithmetic, always calculating the next move. She believed the clock system, and perhaps the town's salvation, rested on the edge of a misread magnetism that would drift every clock out of phase. The mother lode, the valley's prize, belonged to Jedediah Hoke, a mine boss who treated superstition like prayer and bribery like currency. Hoke's greed was anchored by Finch's own past, for his assistant had once fast-forwarded the mother lode's clock by a minute. The clock on the mother lode post was due to expire at noon exactly on Tuesday. A count on that felt like a gauntlet thrown in daylight. Seraph uncovered a forgotten section of the town charter that stated a claim vanished the moment the post was uprooted before the registered time. Realizing Hook would not hesitate to spill blood to keep his prize, she sought a partner who could move with the quiet certainty of a dragline. She found Silas the Quiet Beck, a former Union scout who lived among traps and whispers on the town's edge. She told him the plan: uproot the mother lode post at 11:59, and the valley would become fair game again. Beck looked at her with a cold, steady patience that suggested years of standing still in the world and watching it pass by. Hook has 10 hired guns, he warned, and a shotgun that could split a man in two. A threat wrapped in quiet. Seraph answered with a map drawn in careful lines, a handwriting tracking the approach like a compass needle. On Tuesday morning, the town gathered in a hush to watch Hook and his guards, their breath fogging the square with trepidation. The central clock tower struck the first second of the 11:59 minute, and Beck slid from the oaks as if the forest itself exhaled him. He did not engage Hook's men, he sprinted straight for the post, shouldered it with a splintering crack, and toppled it just as the minute slipped away. The Clockwork claim was nullified by law, and the crowd quickened into a chorus of cheers as dust settled like powdered silver. Beck accepted Seraph's promised reward, a simple, perfectly regulated clock, and then faded back into the silent oaks, leaving Oakhaven to face a future where the race for silver must be won fairly, 1 second at a time. The square at the heart of Oakhaven emptied slowly as the crowd dispersed, leaving only whispers and dust motes dancing in sunbeams. Finch's workshop, once all gleam and brass, now wore a thin film of warriors. His assistant counted the coins due and found them lacking in the promised hurry. Seraph stood by the mother lode post's broken base, tracing with her fingers the ridges where the wood had met the earth in a final, decisive moment. She knew the charter's blunt truth could be weaponized just as easily as a clock. Whoever controlled the measurement controlled the town's fate. Yet she also understood that nullifying a single post did not erase the fear. Hook's meant or the friction in Finch's gears, it simply rearranged them. The following dawn, Seraph proposed a new system. No claim would expire without a visible public audit at noon, and every clock face would be calibrated by a rotating panel of 2 surveyors and 1 clockmaker. Finch stiffened at the suggestion, but the idea took root when he realized Seraph could not be bought and could not be bluffed by a faster gun. The town's miners, tired of corruption's drift, volunteered to act as witnesses, bringing a ledger of times instead of a ledger of bribes. Seraph and a newly hired apprentice tinkered with the mother lode post to add a small secondary dial that would show the minutes sideways, a reminder of the drift they suspected. On the next market day, a crowd gathered around the square, and the old clock tower told in a steady, honest rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. Beck's departure was felt more as a ghostly invitation than a loss, a reminder that quiet strength still walked among the oaks. Some townsfolk whispered that the Clockwork claim still held secrets, perhaps a hidden gear, mother lode's base, perhaps a forgotten loophole in the charter. Seraph smiled to herself, realizing that the real Clockwork was not the brass and gears, but the discipline of citizens who refused to let fear govern time. Finch, for once, kept his chalkboard clear of schematics for a day, letting the sun mark the minutes without any artificial tick-tocks to guide him. A scout arrived from a distant valley with word that a rival syndicate would test the old claim law elsewhere and might copy Oakhaven's method if it proved successful. Seraph drafted a short message to the scout: let them come, and let them count the seconds, as will be counted with fairness, not coercion. The clock in the square bore witness to the town's new vow: its brass face catching light like a stubborn star, refusing to lie for silver. When the first new notice of the mother lode post was completed without incident, cheers rose from the boughs of the market stalls, and the oaks seemed to lean closer, listening. Even Huck, in a rare moment of fatigue, muttered that perhaps the valley could be bought only if time itself allowed it, and he turned away with a sigh. And so Oakhaven learned to measure itself anew. Every second earned through shared courage until the old, patient oaks could grow as tall as their stories demanded. Beck turned away with a sigh, and the broken post clutched like a relic of a gamble won and lost. For a moment the valley held its breath, as if the oaks themselves were listening to the minute hand ticking down. Seraph stood beside the crowd, not smiling, but steady, watching the future be measured in small, stubborn acts. The mother lode would still gleam as silver outside the post, but inside the town as ledger something else had shifted. Finch, pale as brass, stepped toward his clock tower with a nerve that barely concealed his tremor. He announced nothing aloud, yet the crowd heard in his breath the first crack in a carefully laid plan. The wind picked up, scented with pine and smoke, and the first hint of rain on iron roofs. Seraph's eyes tracked every thread of her guessment as if they were lines on a brittle map. She knew the Clockwork claim would only stand if the town believed in its fairness, not in a second-hand victory. The Kess silhouette melted back into the oaks, leaving behind only the quiet, cold commitment of a man who trusted no one but truth. The clock faces on the remaining posts, unblinking, seemed to grow suddenly honest, not merely ornamental. At council after sundown, Finch proposed sealing the mother lode under the law he had authored, but Seraph challenged him without anger. She laid out a compromise: a public auditable stations, a rotating clockkeeper who would log drift, and a city-wide standard to reset posts when necessary. The guest bribes burned like small coals in the fireplace of his conscience, turning his bravado into ashfield noise. The valley slept, but not soundly, for every rustle in the leaves sounded like another clock changing its mind. The next morning, Seraph and Beck walked the line with a hand-drawn rookery of magnetic stations, counting time against the sun. The oaks whispered in the wind, as if blessing a system that finally allowed human error to be acknowledged rather than buried. When the first noon came after the changes, the clock on the mother lode post did not ignite a thrill, but a sense of shared responsibility among the townsfolk. Finishing the day, Seraph found Beck at the edge of the woods, the new clock ticking softly in his pack, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. So Oakhaven learned to measure itself anew, not by a single minute saved or lost, but by a chorus of honest ticks that could outlive any silver fever. The town exhaled in the wake of Beck's sprint and the splintering of the old post. Seraph stood where the dust settled, counting breaths as if each one could tune the valley back to order. Finch, ever methodical, stepped from the crowd with a folded ledger that bore the sheen of new dawns and new promises. He nodded to Seraph, not with triumph, but with a quiet respect for a plan that had nearly undone him. The mother lode's clock face still glinted, a stubborn reminder that clocks could be both ally and adversary. If the drift exists, Seraph said, it must be measured, not merely observed by luck at noon. Finch replied, then let the town become a lattice of checks, not a single wheel on a hill. That afternoon the two set up a demonstration, 3 posts each with its own regulator, linked by a shared signal line. A brass bell rung at every per-minute change to train the town to watch the ticks rather than the gun barrels. Seraph calibrated the mother lode clock against the central tower, noting how magnetic interference tugged at the readings like a stray cat at a clockwork door. The guest's return, when it came, was not dramatic but quiet, the way someone re-enters a room without announcing themselves, and it unsettled more than a gunfight ever did. He walked into Finch's workshop and left the clock he had claimed on a workbench, a simple token that he still trusted in the most exacting way. A 1-second grace, Beck said, is a mercy, not a loophole, and Finch pocketed the thought with the rest of his diagrams. The town council, led by a weary but hopeful elder, voted to adopt Seraph's redefinition of a claim: no post should ever decide a future again without a chorus of checks speaking in unison. Oakhaven planted a new standard, a boundary of iron and timber where each claim was logged with a synchronized almost timestamp and a promise of periodic verification. The Clockwork claim system grew a public archive, a wooden cabinet with glass doors that ticked softly and kept every registered time as a seed for the future. The people learned to measure themselves not by the minute that expired, but by the minutes tossed back and forth as questions and verifications. Her guess influence waned as he faced fines, audits, and a valley that could no longer be bought with fear, though his hunger lingered like the taste of cold metal. Seraph's maps gained a new accuracy, turning the hills into a logic problem rather than a battlefield, and Finch began drafting a firmware of sorts for the clocks, an adaptive regulator that could sense anomalies across the Oak Valley. In the end, the valley lived by a chorus of honest techs, and the tale of the Clockwork claim became less about silver and more about how time, when shared, could outlive any fever. The crowd exhaled as the dust settled, and the first murmurs of doubt gave way to cautious applause. Seraph walked the edge of the crowd, eyes on the broken post now cradled by Beck's gloved fingers. She did not smile, but a slow, tearful line of relief crept into her jaw. Finch's plan, which had once wrapped the valley in neat boxes of certainty, now felt more fragile than brass gears in a storm. Through the rattle of birds and a distant hammer, the clock on every post still ticked, counting the minutes toward a fair daylight. Beck's shadow moved away from the crowd and toward the oak-shadowed edgeway, his straps light as if he were returning to a quieter justice. He did not cut a dramatic figure, but his stride carried the weight of someone who had saved the town without claiming glory. Seraph approached the shattered post and touched the soil where it had stood, feeling the fur resonant mineral dust mingle with the memory of a near defeat. Time is a map, not a weapon, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, as she brushed away the last splinters. In the days that followed, Oakhaven converted the near-mythic clock into a civic symbol, a brass dial mounted at every council hall and guard post, linked by a lattice of copper wires. The Clockwork claim method persisted in spite of the mother lode's loss, because it had proven that coincidence could be outmaneuvered by careful, audacious math. Seraph and Finch struck a cautious accord. She would supervise the clocks, ensuring that any drift due to magnetism or weather was tracked, not ignored. Finch, humbled, admitted that order wasn't merely a set of rules but a living discipline requiring trusted eyes and quick minds. For his part, Beck refused to be made a hero, choosing instead to finish his rounds and leave the social stage to others who would defend the valley with a steadier hand. The tents were found a strange pride in their shared vigilance, as if the clocks themselves were new anchors against greed's tide. Children would press their noses to the glass of shopfront clocks, counting minutes in pairs, with Seraph's voice inside their heads reminding them to be precise. Jedhook vanished into the mountains, not as a fugitive, but as a cautionary memory, and the valley slept lighter at night with the threat of legal consequences in its air. The Motherlode's days dwindled into rumor and negotiation, as the valley learned that markets could be tamed not by force but by coordination. When the first noontime bell rang after the incident, the town held its breath and then exhaled together. It sounded like gears cooling after a long pressure. And somewhere beyond the last pines, Beck's whistle drifted back on the breeze, a simple note that said, in its own language, that time, once counted for many, was now counted by all. It settled over the Motherlode like ash after a summer storm, and the town exhaled in a single breath of awe. Seraph's eyes searched the crowd for signs of fear or greed, and she found neither only a way relief that a clock could be kept honest, even if it stung. Finch appeared at the edge of the square, hands still, as if the gears inside him might spontaneously disengage, and he admitted nothing with a look. A few merchants began to unroll their wares that would have been denied by the rush, a windfall tempered by the knowledge that the system still stood, not the man who profited from it. Seraph stepped between Finch and the crowd and laid the broken post on the ground, as a relic, a reminder that time does not bow to power. She explained to the onlookers that nullification meant not just a change of ownership, but a reset of trust, and trust was a coin rarer than silver. Beck, quiet as ever, reappeared from the oaks with his own whistle, which now carried a note of rain-swept iron, and he kept the distance between himself and questions. He handed Seraph the single clock he had promised, and it ticked with a patient certainty that made the square feel larger than it was. The crowd muttered questions about what would come next, and Seraph answered with plans, a revised map, a timetable, and a promise to order every post for drift. The town's clockmaker clan, a quiet subset of Oakhaven's artisan guild, began to gather in a circle, sharpening razors of iron and ideas, to discuss how to mechanize time without weaponizing it again. Finch, for once, raised his voice not to berate but to propose a commission that would supervise future claims and maintain the integrity of the clocks. He did not apologize, but the tremor in his voice suggested he understood that control, without consent, breeds monsters, and consent required witnesses. As the sun climbed higher, a caravan of prospectors, rough men and curious women crept into the valley, drawn by the legal shield now proven real. Seraph walked the fringe of the square with Silas Beck, discussing who would be allowed to register claims once more, and how to keep the system impartial. Beck spoke rarely, but when he did it was to remind her that a single, Second, of bravery could outlast a lifetime of talking, and his first duty would be to protect the weak from new schemes. By noon, the mother lode clock stood dark, its face unlit, as if it too needed rest after proof had been offered to the valley. The townsfolk began to debate what fair looked like in a land where men were well-drawn eyes to every horizon, and Seraph listened to the arguing with a smile that was equal parts relief and caution. She realized that the clockwork claim had become a metaphor. The valley's sense of order would endure only if the clock's hands moved in concert with the people's will, not in the shadow of a solitary genius. As dusk bled into the pines, a small procession formed, with Beck at the center, carrying the uprooted post as a kind of totem, a warning to the next claimant that time was a shared with her, not a private with a system. And with that quiet procession, the valley learned to count together once again, and the whistle that had lilted from Beck's lips was echoed by Seraph's careful arithmetic, the ticking clocks that would never again be tricked by greed. The valley exhaled in a hush that felt almost holy. Seraph slid the charter back into her satchel and watched the crowd relax into patient listening. Finch stood on the veranda, ledger in one hand and doubt in the other, as if time itself had become a suspect. He didn't raise his voice, but his gaze kept skimming over the uprooted post like a man counting losses. Beck, calm as a snowfall, held the broken post as if it were a relic of a time that could be measured again. The motherlode's clock lay in the dust, its brass face dulled but its numbers stubbornly legible. A sudden gust rattled the oaks and carried the faint sound of gears turning from somewhere unseen. The crowd murmured, and the murmuring took on a rhythm, the rhythm of the true clocks binding the town together. A travelling surveyor offered to map magnetic variants for the next batch of posts, and Seraph nodded. The town council approved a public standard tied to a relay tower at the old mill, a beacon for fair dealing. Hook's hired guns dwindled away, some melted into the trees. Others found the cowardice in their pockets too heavy to bear. Silas Beck, still a shadow in the pines, began teaching children the art of counting, how to measure, estimate, and weight. The village blacksmith kept pace with the new tempo, turning out gear after gear that collected into the town's growing heartbeat. Minutes became allies again, clinics opened on schedule, schools rang with bells, and markets traded by time rather than bluff. Hoke's influence waned, his letters sought mercy from a system he hadn't understood, and the town hardly answered. At night, the square clocks chimed in unison, like a choir of patient hands polishing the day into memory. Seraph started a course in clockwork ethics, where precision met justice and precision served the common good. Finch erected a new post bearing a compass instead of a clock, signaling a shift from control to direction guided by consent. The valley learned to count together again, and the whistle from Beck's lips, once a rumor, was echoed by Seraph's arithmetic and the steady ticking of trusted clocks. When the sun sank behind the oaks, Beck taped his hat to Seraph and disappeared into the trees, leaving Oakhaven to measure its future as a community, not a gamble. The square emptied of the tense glitter of a standoff, leaving only the rasp of pines and a few coughing dust motes. Seraph pocketed the moment in her mind like a precise seed, already drafting how to rework Finch's clockwork system so it could never be gained again. Finch himself arrived later, coat dented by oak sap, eyes calculating the margins of influence he still controlled. He claimed the uprooted post as evidence that order had prevailed, while quietly negotiating a revision to the charter that would allow posts moving with a majority vote. Seraph shook her head and laid out new constraints, insisting that any post removal must be observed by 3 independent timers. The town council, bored with drama and hungry for legitimacy, accepted the compromises as a price for peace. Yet even as the crowd thinned, a rumor wove through the oaks that the motherlode's future would hinge on the weather and the windings of the valley's magnetic history. Seraph began teaching apprentices how to place pseudo-sentinel clocks at the edge of property lines, devices that would fail safe if the earth shifted or the wind misread the dials. Silas Beck, meanwhile, did not return to the inn with the trophy of the broken post, but rather to the edge of the map where snow still lay in memory. He tended to his traps and watched the valley with the stillness of a man who had learned to listen for the weight of things that do not speak aloud. In the weeks that followed, a series of minor claims fluttered into the light, all of them settled by careful timing rather than brute force. The clock tower chronicler, a young scribe hired by the town to record every tick, found that even the clocks began to behave with a truer conscience. A creak in the motherlode post memory gnawed at Jed Hooker's pride, for his bribes had bought minutes but not the weather of truth. People spoke of the oak trees not as witnesses to greed, but as guardians of a fragile balance between mining hunger and communal trust. Finch, alone in his workshop, polished a brass dial and admitted to himself that his grand design might survive only if He recast the claim so that no single clock could decide a fate. He drafted a new system where the posted time would be synchronized not by a single post, but by a lattice of distributed increments across the valley floor. When Seraph visited his desk, she offered him a compromise. The mother lode could be tested only if a genuine anomaly could be demonstrated in both magnetism and timekeeping. Hoke, hearing murmurs of reform, began to lose his grip on the valley's nerves and found himself cornered by his own greed. The deadline for the mother lode, now no longer a single second, hung over the valley like a bell that might or might not toll. And as the oaks breathed the evening chill of the Sierra, Seraph and Beck shared a glance full of future coordinates, not of gold, but of trust. And the valley began to wake to a new kind of order, one that waited for the clock to be right in more than minutes. Seraph pocketed the jagged edge of the uprooted post, its grain still warm from the soil. She watched Beck vanish into the grove, his steps counting out the seconds in a language only he understood. The townsfolk began recalibrating their habits around the single steady rhythm they could trust. The old towers echo and Beck's returned to the woods. Finch, ever the engineer, gathered his notes and admitted to himself that the perfect system might survive only with a mind to adapt. Seraph proposed a temporary council of 3 to oversee claims, comprised of her, a deputy, and Silas as witness, to ensure no one could bribe the clocks again. Silas, the quiet, appeared at the edge of the square with a fox skin bag and a new set of traps that didn't depend on metallic parts. The mother lode would be auctioned by the new rule, not to the highest bribe, but to the most accurate meteorological and magnetic readings collected by Seraph and Silas over the next week. The town charter was reread, and the clause about immediate nullification was formalized, and the clock post would be removed only when replaced by a portable, field-accurate timekeeper. Seraph and Beck had agreed to meet whenever the oaks whispered unusually. The map Beck had drawn was folded into an invisible compass. On quiet evenings, the river carried the metallic glint of the old clock's remnants, a reminder that time could be mined as well as minerals. People found themselves calculating risk not by inches of gold, but by minutes of caution, and the valley grew patient. Hook's bribery left a ghostly residue, but law had become a habit, and fear wore thin. Clocks in the town square no longer dictated the pace. Instead, the rhythm of hammer and spade did. Finch, for all his precision, admitted to Seraph that the system had been a trap as much as a map. He offered to help repair any misaligned posts, but his help would only be accepted if it came with transparent oversight. The first real test of the new order came when a storm lashed the valley and knocked witnesses off their feet, yet no one panicked about the timing of repairs. When the rain cleared, Seraph found a new pattern. The clocks ticked in imperfect synchrony, but the people trusted the sequence because it matched their lived experience. Beck returned from the woods with a single silver thread of his own making, a reminder that some things in Oakhaven belonged to those who watched the clocks together. He didn't seek the mother lode anymore, only the certainty that the next minute would arrive on time for someone who needed it most. And so the valley woke, not to the thunder of hooves and pickaxes, but to a patient, shared chronicle with trust, not greed, kept time for them all. The town exhaled as if it could hear the space between takes. Finch's workshop felt quiet, every tool waiting for a decision he could not force by Clockwork alone. Seraph kept the broken post in the cedar box, a grim keepsake and the reminder that time could be bent but not cornered forever. The mother lode's post lay on the ground, its register null as the Lord decreed, and a new question rose with it: who would write time now? Word travelled that the claim would remain idle until the charter and the clocks could be rejoined in a common rhythm. Miners whispered plans for revision, while Seraph asked them to test the other posts against the valley wind and the Oakhaven shadow. Finch admitted, without shouting, that a single heartbeat in a post would never outpace a community with shared candor. A flurry of small reforms began, a second brass ace installed on the central tower, and a ledger page for every calibration. Beck returned to the edge of the woods, not to boast but to listen for quiet changes in the valley's tempo. The children started counting seconds aloud during chores, turning time into a social habit rather than a private fear. Seraph proposed a triad of oversight herself, Beck, and a roving chronometer maker who would keep the town honest when the sun rose elsewhere. The forgotten clause of the charter woke up in people's minds, becoming a living rule rather than a dusty warning. Spring rains brought dust, but there also was a stubborn belief that time could be managed with consent, not coercion. Magnetic quirks were mapped, allowing future calibrations to ride the weather and the altitude rather than defy them. Finch unveiled a network of interlocked clocks, designed to speak to one another and to the town ledger in a chorus rather than a solo. The mother lode might have finally found its conclusion in a practical compromise, wealth redirected toward shared infrastructure and schools. Seraph's eye softened as she watched Beck stride along the lanes at dusk, leaving behind a trail of quiet, purposeful footprints. Oakhaven learned that a clock's honesty depends on a community willing to read it together, even when the readings sting. The silver rush still buzzed on the hills, but it arrived under rules that the valley had shaped with patient hands. The Clockwork claim survived as a living story time kept not by one brave poet, but by a chorus of people who chose to trust the shared temper.